Some information presented in this series is based on theory. These theories are not the only possible interpretations. I was messaging with a friend and he mentioned neurodivergent. He mentioned that he may be that way and suggested there's a possibility I am too. This is an important topic, I figure, right now because of the popularity of autism, and I wanted to discuss it. I wanted to explore it and discuss why I don't think that I'm necessarily autistic, but I'm open to the label of neurodivergence. Now, according to the Wikipedia article on neurodiversity, Judy Singer had originally coined the phrase neurodivergent in 1997. It quotes her suspicion, the article quotes her suspicion that she is somewhere on the autism spectrum. Now, what is autism spectrum? The article mentions various neuro issues or diagnoses such as ADHD, developmental speech disorders, dysgraphia, dyspraxia, Tourette syndrome, and schizoaffective disorder, in addition to several others I didn't even bother to list. Now I'm open to this label. I'm open to the label of neurodivergency. However, the idea of autism irks me. And there was a friend that I talked with that she would mention that she was on the autism spectrum, and she would talk about how certain other people gave off signs of being on the autism spectrum. She also talked about how other people are narcissists and so forth. I think she had a fixation on those two things, autism and narcissism. I don't believe I'm not on the autism spectrum. My suspicion is that the autism spectrum itself needs to be better clarified. My experience with autism, I guess my earliest image of autism is from the movie Rain Man. Dustin Hoffman's character is a sort of functional autistic. I figure that some of you may also be wondering if you're on the autism spectrum, or you've had experiences where you felt your thinking pattern is different from others, so forth. I want to take you on my journey. I want to share with you my life experiences growing up, and let's see what we can conclude at the end. Mom told me about how when I was a little toddler, I would be doing something in the other room, and when the TV show All in the Family would come on, I would stop what I was doing. I would crawl in. This shows you how young I was because she used the term crawl. I would crawl in. I would just sit down and enjoy the show. She would say I would laugh at the jokes, and the appropriate jokes. I mean, like as any viewer would, as any older viewer would. And then when it was done, I would crawl back to whatever it was I was doing and just continue doing that. I like that anecdote my mom said, because it showed even at that young age how attuned I was to the actual production of the show. That sounds awkward. I was an active listener. I was an active viewer in the show. I wasn't just sitting in front of a TV set just zoning out. I never have done that. I've been very active, proactive in how I watch TV shows, and it was only a few years later, maybe a decade later, when I was writing stories that I was interested in television, and that quickly evolved into wanting to write for television. I remember Transformers coming on. I remember those Transformers toys would have in the packaging what was called a tech spec. It was a paragraph and a set of statistics on the character, and I would copy these over in a spiral notebook, and then I would use that as what's used in the television industry as a series Bible. Now, this series Bible would be something that a writer or a producer would have in mind when designing a new TV show. It would start off with a cover page mentioning the title of the show, perhaps what the premise of the show is, and what the genre it is. Whether it's a cop show, cop show, a detective show, action adventure, comedy, family sitcom, that kind of thing. And then after that, it would list the premise, it would describe the premise of the show, and then another section would talk about the characters, devote perhaps a paragraph to each character. Another section would be about the sets and locales that are involved, the standard locales, the standard sets that would need to be constructed, and another section would include various episode plots. Now, what I was creating wasn't as extravagant as this, but it's nice that I would keep this spiral notebook and I would copy the paragraphs on the boxes describing each Transformers character, and I would use that when writing my own Transformers stories. Now, I'm getting a little ahead of myself again. Let me tell you an anecdote that my mom told me when I was, again, a toddler. I believe I was just beginning to write, or I may have just begun speaking. And my dad was very enthusiastic, very excited, and he got blocks, those letter blocks. Each block would have a letter on it. And he would practice with me. Well, he would let me phrase what I wanted to say by putting blocks together in sentences. There were no space blocks, so that when I began writing, I didn't include breaks between words. So she said I had to get into the habit of separating the words in my sentences when I did begin to write. Now, my elementary school experience can be broken up into two parts because at the beginning of fourth grade, around October 4th, I had moved to a different school. It was still within the same school district, but it was a different school. In the earlier school, I remember playing with the other kids at recess. I don't remember being picked on at all. It was pretty nice. There was one kid in particular that shared an interest in Transformers and Star Wars and a few other things. And on some perhaps subconscious level, we became friends, and I would visit his house and we would talk not just about the Transformers toys themselves, but we would speculate on the universe of the Transformers. We would speculate on other things like Star Wars. We would ask each other questions. What do you think about this? And do you think this? Do you suppose that? And we would share ideas. And there was a really strong mental bond there that I do miss. I moved to a new school, and by that point, I was interested. I had become interested, if not already been interested, in reading adult books about UFOs, Loch Ness Monster, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, all that stuff, all that fascinating stuff. I was also writing stories by that point. Now, that was in fourth grade, beginning of fourth grade, and I became interested in Star Trek a year or something later on, a couple years later on. And when that happened, I was interested in writing Star Trek episodes myself, little Star Trek stories. And in addition to reading about the paranormal, I was also interested in reading and learning about how television is made, how television shows are produced, everything that goes on behind the scenes of producing movies, films, and TV shows. I was also drawing a lot too, at a pretty good level. Maybe in a future video I'll share some of my early drawings because they're all packed away. Thankfully my mom saved everything I did, and I'd like to share them with you. But I want to emphasize that the TV shows I was watching at that age, about 10, 11, 12, were adult sitcoms, adult drama. I wasn't just interested in sitting in front of a TV set. I didn't just sit in front of a TV set and zone out and just superficially watch the shows. If it was especially interesting, like Star Trek, Transformers, Silver Spoons, Bosom Buddies, Punky Brewster, Night Court, you name it, whatever the show was, my mind was able to grasp the themes in the show, the character interrelationships, their reactions to each other. Not only that, but on a writer's level, even though I wasn't writing yet, on a writer's level, as I was watching the show, I could understand the points of the episode, the morality lessons. I don't want to call them morality lessons, the messages in the show, the themes in the show. Like, for example, this episode is talking about this theme and it's exploring it in these different ways through these different characters' individual voices. To give you a sense of my mom's age, she was in her 50s when I was growing up in the 1980s. She enjoyed reading science fiction when a number of famous writers were just establishing themselves in the 1940s. So I think that ability to enjoy higher level intellectual stuff, especially stuff that's also infused with themes like philosophical themes, morality themes, carried over into my genes. I consider myself pretty sociable. Even at that time, I would have been open to talking with other kids. I could talk with classmates. I was pretty friendly. I don't remember a lot of shared common interests. There was some kind of interest barrier. I would not call it a language barrier. I would not call it a language barrier. It was more of an intellectual barrier, although I don't want to say that for fear that it would come across as elitist, but I remember some gossiping on their part. I just remember not being interested in the same things that they were. It seemed as if my scope of interest was larger and more worldly. It was just very different. I was interested in television. Again, I was interested in drawing. I had another neighborhood kid that I would play with, and this neighborhood kid had just become interested in Star Trek. I was already interested in Star Trek, and we would play this Star Trek-like scenario where we would be ourselves but set in a future time, and there would be a spaceship and we were explorers, and he spun it off from this book series he had read called A Wrinkle in Time, and I enjoyed Star Trek, so I kind of moved it towards being something Star Trek-like. But that just shows how creative I was with my friends and how I tended to bond more with people who were on the creative side. Now that's all healthy. Now, what about how I was in school, how I felt in school? Well, moving to the second school, first of all, I missed that good close friend I had. We were still able to visit. I would take the bus at a young age. I would take the bus over to his house and visit for a while, and I'd have to take the bus back. It wouldn't surprise me if sometimes his parent would drive me back home. Really, it wasn't that far, but to a child, changing schools, not school systems, but still changing schools, it it did seem like a huge change. And there were different kids there. I remember there was a lot of being picked on, and this is probably a common experience that maybe everybody goes through. I've blocked it out of my mind. I've blocked a lot of it out of my mind. Of course, my experience in school was different. I remember being picked on a lot. I remember crying quite a few times. And when I would cry, I would just hold my hands around my face. And there was sort of a mournful cry. I remember liking when I would hear the voice of someone saying, "Oh, what's wrong?" or "What happened?" asking someone else what happened. To be honest, because it showed that they were concerned about me. I mean, being picked on, you, I suppose, enjoy those moments when someone actually shows sympathy or empathy and they actually show that they care about you. So while I kept up some visits with this other friend from this other school where we both shared Transformers, there was a kid in my current class that also liked Transformers, and we would get together more often and we would talk about toys. We would talk about other things too, but it wasn't on the same intellectual level. It wasn't on the same philosophical level as that relationship with the friend from the earlier school. So in my school experience, I suppose I was content. I didn't want to be in school just because I was so eager to develop my own self, develop my career, move to Los Angeles and establish myself as a television series writer, eventually TV series creator. And I just had to go through school because I needed to get that high school diploma. And feeling ostracized or feeling separate from the other kids continued on. I didn't date at all. I didn't find any common interests or commonality with the other kids. I just went in, did my duty at school, was picked on. I didn't like gym class because they'd pick on me, and I would go home after school. And so I assumed that everybody thought the same way I did. That would change with an experience at the end of high school. There was somebody that I tried to open up to and develop more of a friendship bond with, and it didn't end well, and it left me lonely during my college years. At some point, I developed a crush on Madonna, and I was attracted to her bravery, her ambition, her wit, and at the same time, I was still looking for a girlfriend. I felt lonely, and I've talked about this before, but I would have these fantasy glimpses. It wasn't that I was delusional. It was like I would imagine Madonna, and I would imagine just interacting with her and sharing these artistic ambitions and wondering what she would say and wondering what she would think about me and what we would share together. Now, here's where it gets a little bit murky. Growing up, of course, I had famous authors like David Gerald and Gene Roddenberry and Steven Spielberg. I would read about them, and I would also fantasize sort of about what it would be like to talk with them. It wasn't in the same flavor as the fantasy I had about Madonna, but it was still on that notion of having some kind of intellectual friendship, sharing ideas, and creative, artistic discussions. About this time, college age, maybe years after college, when I was trying to look for work, I felt stuck. My mom would tell me these anecdotes about her brother, my uncle, and his children, my first cousins, how they were able to become successful in whatever they were pursuing. It seemed that they had more opportunities in life. Now, granted, keep in mind, I was living with my mom. I felt very isolated, especially isolated because the other classmates had moved away. You know, this was a few years already after high school. And even though I didn't feel any connection with them when I was in school, it still felt isolating even more because I wasn't seeing them on a regular basis. There weren't those familiar faces anymore. So I felt very isolated. And my mom and I would take these walks around just to go to the restaurant or grocery store or whatever. And she would tell me about how this cousin of mine was living in New York City and has been talking with this other person who's famous or somehow established in a certain industry. And it was like I felt like I was a fish in a fishbowl looking out, and maybe I wouldn't be able to amount I wouldn't be able to reach the status where I could demonstrate to the world, to everybody I've known in my life, that I'm capable of that too. It flows through the genes. My mom had it, I have it, and her brother had it evidently by what she was telling me. It was like I was listening to stories about my kin, like my blood kin, accomplishing these things and me being trapped geographically where I was, financially where I was, and wondering if I would be able to do the same things or at least reach the same pinnacle. And it bothered me very much that I didn't have those resources and I felt stuck in place, and it would being geographically isolated as I was, as I still am, I thought it's that much more of an uphill struggle. In those years during college, when I would write to some former classmates, people I hadn't really interacted with, but for whatever reason I just reached out to, or I had some past interaction with, and I would sometimes call and we would talk, not often, but a lot of times I would write letters, and I was very confused. I was still reeling from this aftermath of having tried to reach out to this person that I'd mentioned the end of high school, trying to figure out, trying to understand what had happened. And I had assumed, still by that point, I had assumed that everybody thought the same way I did. And it was very confusing. I was reaching out to these classmates to see if they could explain something that I had missed. Like, by the very nature of the experience, I was dealing with it subjectively. And I figured that somebody on the outside, somebody who had been more used to interacting with other classmates, might be able to enlighten me on where what I may have been missing. Like, they could have more of an objective view of what happened. And so that's why I reached out to them. And I found that a number of them would say that I was smart, and in a good way, and that sometimes they couldn't understand me. And so, having grown up with instincts towards writing for television and being a storyteller, I would try to explain my points of view with allegory or analogy to television series or famous things in history, like famous historical anecdotes, like something, for example, in Einstein's childhood growing up, or some experience that this other famous person had that seemed similar to mine. I wanted to convey how I felt. And there's something about doing that through storytelling that I think is more universal than just me giving facts and figures. I thought perhaps they could relate to the story, or perhaps something popular in television, popular in the culture. But I found that they didn't know as much as I did, even when I was doing that. And I don't know how much of it they understood, but I'm willing to guess that it wasn't much. Even though I was explaining myself very thoroughly, I don't want to say very thoroughly, even though I was explaining myself through these allegories and analogies very smoothly, I think very clearly, maybe it wasn't getting through. I don't know, because they didn't really give me feedback. I want to tell you about a theory that I came across just now in preparing my script for this video. It's called the double empathy problem theory. I found it in an article in Wikipedia about, I believe, neurodivergence. Let me just read what I have here. It was conceived by autistic scholar Damian Milton in 2012. Conversation and socialization of autistic groups, non-autistic groups, and mixed groups was studied. The finding was that autistic people were more able to build rapport with other autistic people than with non-autistic people. This was at the same level as the rapport within the purely non-autistic people. I mentioned that I would write these letters, and in those letters to classmates, I would use allegory to television shows and things in popular culture. Well, I'm going to do that in this video too, since this is sort of a letter. I remember a Star Trek episode of the original 1960s TV series where Captain Kirk is split into two people. One person, by a transporter accident, just simply split into two people, and one person retains his aggressive nature. The other person retains his calmness and empathy. And the one with the empathy is, of course, less aggressive, is more passive, and he realizes that he must confront this aggressive version of himself so that the two could be recombined in the transporter. And so there's a scene in the engineering room in Star Trek, in the ship's engineering room, and the aggressive version is holding a phaser, a gun, at the passive one, and the passive one just keeps right on walking towards him, and he's trying to talk with him. He's saying, "Don't you understand? We can't survive separate like this. We have to be recombined." And you can see the fear in the aggressive version's eyes. And later on in the what they call sick bay, they have the aggressive version knocked out and he's strapped in bed, and the passive version of Kirk is talking with the doctor, and the doctor remarks that he, meaning the passive, the empathetic version, has the intellectual ability. In other words, what does he have? He doesn't have the aggressive strength, but he has the compassion and the intellect. And the doctor suggests that perhaps that's where man's eternal courage comes from. For you see, he was afraid and you weren't. And that jives with what I suspect, that I don't think people are really less capable or more capable of social interaction. I think this autism I think this suspicion that there is an inability between people who are more capable of social interactions and those who aren't, I think that's hogwash. I think we're all capable of learning. I think we're all capable of doing these great things that I have been, creative writing and showing interest and developing ourselves. I think it's more like the crab mentality. I think people are conditioned from a young age not to be ambitious, not to explore themselves creativity. I think that people are conditioned in childhood not to explore their creativity, and with creativity there's ambition. I think we're all ambitious. I think we have fun being ambitious and creative, and there's a theory called IFS, internal family systems. Dr. Richard Schwartz said that he found when people talk about their own true nature, they say that it's that part of them that embodies like 8 different C's: creativity, compassion, courage, and a bunch of other C's. And I think there's something to that. I suspect that at our core, we're naturally curious, compassionate, courageous, creative, and all those other C's, and that over time there are these other parts that are put on us through experiences, traumas, stuff like that, and we're conditioned to shelter that. We're conditioned to create these shells that prevent us, that inhibit us from being at our core personality. I really do think that this is that crab mentality, as if there's this bucket and you have several crabs inside. One of the crabs becomes venturesome and tries to crawl out of the bucket, and for whatever reason, the other crabs pull this crab down so that he can stay stuck in this bucket and not go anywhere. It's bizarre. It's really weird. I thought of it as just laziness on other people's part. Like, it's not that hard to associate this with that. It's not hard to become a better writer if you work at it and you really want to improve yourself. I haven't thought of myself as special, but in producing this video, I thought maybe there are people who don't think the same way I do. Perhaps their thinking pattern really is different. I don't like to think about it that way, but maybe that's true. What do you think? I'll leave it at that. I will prepare my next video. I've got a lot of videos in store, and I'll see you next time. Hi, future me here. I wanted to pop in and add that maybe this exploration into neurodivergence helps us understand personality types better than the MBTI, the Myers-Briggs personality quotient, however, the MBTI, those 16 personality types. Maybe the study into autism and different aspects of the autism spectrum. Maybe all of us have these different aspects to varying degrees. Maybe it sheds light on a more accurate, more reliable set of personality types. If you enjoy this content, please spread the word about Visionary Ventures.